them. And so the Potawatomi spoke French. And these two French monks who came. I point that out because when the Potawatomi gave the tour last June down below, they said like all the missions, all the children had to learn to speak English. And their native language was not. And here that we had monks accommodating them because they spoke French and came to them. But anyway, you know that 1875 the monastery was founded. 1 year up here on top of the hill, Oklahoma wind back and forth. There were no trees on top of the hill. There was nothing to break the wind, so it was too cold, too harsh. And so then they moved down below where there's a little more shelter. And we'll go down there in a little bit. The fire. In 1875 and 1901, they had all their buildings. Then the fire broke out in 1901, wiped everything away. The model that St. Gregory's Abbey had made in 1975 for the Centennial of the founding is back there in the lobby. And it shows what buildings were. And once we get down there and you stand by the cemetery and you look to the north, and where there's a depression down there, that was still the basement of the monastery, all the way over. And you can see how huge those buildings were, how long, how close to the bakery it came. But in after the fire, they were concerned about fire. And they decided to change some of their missionary work. Some of it because the roads hadn't come through here and there wasn't the travel that expected. So some of the monks went to Shawnee, built that big building that you're there to celebrate, and we had the Centennial of this church. But fire certainly meant a lot. And so they built this church as the parish church. 4 new settlers, Germans, some French, various ones. And the first pastor was a Christian group, as his father in that window. This was all built and finished in 1914, 1915. It was blessed in June 1915. And so we had the Centennial of this church last June. It's poured concrete. They built the frames, and in 3 days, 3 continuous days, 24 hours a day, you know, you can't stop pouring concrete. So they started mixing concrete, probably by hand. Bucket brigade would lift it up, and they'd pour it in, back down, back and forth. In 3 days, they built this church. So, but they're concerned about fire. And so they built out of concrete and finished it all with metal interior, metal paneling. If you're old enough, you probably remember that in some stores and different places. But then one of the brothers did some carving. And you think these are marble? Wood, painted to look like marble. And you see that tile and all the carving back there. So we've been here for 100 years on top of the hill. The parish, there were about 65 at Mass Sunday. We had one Mass Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. And I take care of the commission in Wanette and go to the prisons on Saturday morning. Have 2 Masses over in the prisons. Saturday. That's my job. Any questions? The windows, we just had them all out in the last 5 years and refurbished. We just got everything painted about a year ago. New carpets down. And stucco on the outside. The red roof was there when I got here 7 years ago.
Men and women in religious orders who were martyred because they wanted to maintain their religious life. But in the mid-1800s, there was a period of at least détente where the church started to get reestablished, and the first monasteries were being reestablished in France. But there was at the same time in that mid-19th century great missionary fervor as well. So our two founding monks, Father Isidore Robot, and then he had a companion that traveled with him, Brother Dominic Lambert. And Brother Dominic, for example, he was had been a soldier in the papal army. He was a winemaker, a bread maker. He was a farrier for horses. He did just about anything. He was the guy you wanted with you when you were traveling across unexplored territory. Well, our mother monastery received a letter from the Diocese of New Orleans in the early 1870s that said, we're looking for missionaries. Well, our Father Isidore Robot wanted to be a missionary. Well, New Orleans, French-speaking, New World. So he and Brother Dominic made plans to travel. The first ship they were supposed to be on, they missed. But it's a good thing because it sank. Oh, no. So they finally, they came to and they finally made their way to New Orleans, knocked on the door of the bishop. This is in 1872. And the bishop said, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, apparently the Vicar General, the bishop's right hand, had sent the letter asking for missionaries. And they were wanting missionaries, but they didn't want monks. Monks stayed put, you know, and what bishop wants monks around staying put, you know. And so the bishop didn't let them start a monastery. And so they went up to Shreveport, where they settled with some sisters, and Brother Dominic was doing work there, and Father Isidore was looking all over, talking to different dioceses about settling. Bishop of Little Rock, which is an old diocese, no, we don't need you here. The bishop in the Corpus Christi area was looking, they were talking. In the San Antonio area, the diocese of Nacogdoches, and the different degrees of, if the bishop wanted them, well, in La Piquevier, the mother house didn't want them to go there. So they were just going back and forth. Chapter 2, the American Civil War. The American Civil War, as you know, was such a horrible tragedy. But after the war, you know, several of the Native American tribes fought with the Confederacy. They were on the losing side. And that gave occasion for the federal government to rethink and reimpose new treaties. Well, meanwhile, the white population was expanding considerably, and it was heading west, and there were promises made for settling these vast open lands for free. And so the white people were looking for settlement. Well, there's a problem. That land isn't empty. People live there. And so there needed to be a solution for the American Indians in the central Northwest, in the Great Lakes region, in the upper Midwest, in the West. And already, of course, in the 1840s and 50s, the five so-called civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek Muskogee, and Seminole, had been removed to Indian territory because they were people that weren't wanted by the predominant federal government in the East. So they were moved here. Why were they moved to Indian territory? Because it was land that nobody wanted at the period. So after the Civil War, the Indian Removal Acts began to just really increase. And so it now wasn't just the eastern civilized tribes. There were tribes from the northeast and around the Great Lakes and from the west, all being moved to Indian territory, what is basically the state of Oklahoma today. So, and several of these tribes were Catholic. And some were even French-speaking, the Potawatomi, the Osage, peoples who had accepted the Catholic faith in the 1500s and the 1600s. And they were being moved here because nobody wanted this land. So in the meantime, the Potawatomis had been moved 4 or 5 times from their home around the Great Lakes, and they were largely living now in eastern Kansas. If you go up to eastern Kansas, you'll find Potawatomi County. You'll find some of the similar place names as here. Well, the tribe thought they were being offered a reservation now in Indian territory. The tribe debated this. And one part of the tribe thought, we will be greater respected by the American government if we become U.S. citizens. And other members of the tribe said, no, we're not going to do that. The tribe split. The tribe that became U.S. citizens, the first Indians to do so, take U.S. citizenship, became the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. The others who stayed in Kansas were known as the Prairie Potawatomi. Archbishop Shaku of now Philadelphia is a Prairie Man Potawatomi. So then the Citizen Potawatomi thought one more thing. They were all these merchants, very entrepreneurial people. They thought, instead of accepting a reservation as a gift, we'll purchase it. So what meager funds they had, they purchased the allotments here in what is now roughly Potawatomi County. This is important history for us, so bear with me. Now, there was a Jesuit priest in Kansas with the Potawatomi, and he was very devoted to them, and they loved him. At any rate, close that chapter. Here's where it really gets interesting. That bishop from New Orleans, who had refused to give Father Isidore and Brother Dominic permission to settle, was back in Paris. And he bumped into a friend of his who happened to be now the head of the congregation of the propagation of the faith at the Vatican. And there was this territory here that the bishop in Little Rock, he had jurisdiction over, but for all of Arkansas and Indian Territory, he had 7 priests. He was wanting to get rid of this. The bishop in New Orleans didn't want the territory. Nobody wanted it. Even in the church, nobody wanted this territory. But there was concern. What about these Indians who are being moved there? So he suggested to his friend, you know, we need to make this its own jurisdiction in the church, which is called, the forerunner to a diocese is called a prefecture. So I think the church should make this a prefecture, and I know who could be the first prefect apostolic. There's this monk looking for a home. Now this is true according to Father Joseph Murphy, who many of you knew, who wrote the history, right? So sure enough, the prefecture of the Indian Territory is established. Father Isidore is summoned to see the Bishop of Little Rock and said, you've got your home. Congratulations, you're the first prefect apostolic of Indian Territory. So the monks, the railroad, came as far as Atoka in southeastern Oklahoma. It was the MKT, the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, going across eastern Indian Territory, built by Irish railroad workers, which is important. Don't forget that little detail. So they got to Atoka. They arrived in Indian Territory, as Father Joseph says, set foot for the first time in Indian Territory on October 12th, 1875, Columbus Day. Of course, it wasn't Columbus Day then, probably. But 140 years ago this month. And they arrived in Atoka, where there was the first half-built Catholic church in the territory. This church had been built, or half-built, by the Irish railroad workers. I will give you 2 guesses as to what the name of the first Catholic church in today's Oklahoma is.
St. Patrick's.
St. Patrick's. St. Patrick's Parish in Atoka. Very good. You get the prize. You get the shout out today. So they arrived. The church was half built. There was a small 1-room or 2-room rectory and $300 debt. I say, some things for St. Gregory's have never changed. We started with a $300 deficit. I'd like to know what $300 in 1875 amounted to in 2015 dollars. It might be interesting comparison.
Yeah.
Well, from there, that's when Father Isidore began searching for the home, and his first group to visit, some 90 miles away, were the Potawatomis. And the Potawatomis, being French-speaking, Catholic largely, very desirous to have their children educated, says, yes, please settle with us. Well, he was a pretty astute fellow, but he didn't want to sign up with the first people he talked to, so he went shopping. He talked to the Choctaws. The Choctaws said, yeah, we'd love to have you have a school here in the church, but it'll all need to be governed by Choctaw law. Again, Father Isidore, ooh, what is this? No. So he said, no, not just yet, right? So he made another journey. He journeyed from Atoka over all the way up toward the area around El Reno and then south to Lawton, where there was Fort Sill. And he visited down there and said Mass for the troops at Fort Sill. Something we've been doing ever since. Then he made another journey. He went all the way up to Osage country, up north and west of Tulsa. All this within the first 2 months of being here, beginning of winter. No roads, no internet, no GPS. And the Osage were French-speaking and largely Catholic. Better established than the Potawatomi. They really wanted the monks. There's a but, though. In that time period, the federal government appointed the Indian agents. And the Indian agents had full control over what denominations settled with which Indians, regardless of the desires of the tribe. The President Harrison at the time liked what the Quakers did with the Indians in Pennsylvania. By the way, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, in that time period, it's not like everybody just got along. It was illegal to be Catholic. It could be a capital offense to be a Catholic priest in Pennsylvania, as well as Massachusetts, by the way. This is before all those Irish and Italians showed up and changed the story. But at any rate, so the Indian agent, President Harrison appointed a lot of these Quakers as the Indian agents. I hope nobody's a Quaker here, but that's the way things were back then. And the Quaker said, well, you can build a school here, and you can build a church here, but you can't build your monastery here. So sure enough, we built a parish in Pawhuska, beautiful church there, and a couple schools in Pawhuska and Great Horse. And then he visited with the Muskogee, and then he visited with the groups, the Sac and Fox, and then he came back down to, and finally, of course, what happened, we went back to the Potawatomi. And the Potawatomi there at the end of 1875, Father Adrian said, this land, a square mile of land, was given to the monks for the purpose of building the school and the church and the monastery. So that relationship with the Potawatomis goes way back. And the monks, in addition to their complex here, with its school, they built the school. And when we say school, you know, it's all ages. It's children up through adults in industrial college. So it really is the whole variety, the gamut of what was needed. And then there was a school for the girls, which was built on the property, which the Sisters of Mercy staffed for most of the history there. And after the fire of 1901, when the monks rebuilt a school here as well, the sisters also rebuilt their school, put about a quarter of a mile farther away from the monks. I think they were trying to get away from those boys. I don't know. But they kept their school open until 1954, 1955. And if you're familiar with the photographer and novelist Brother Teen, the great crime novels of Tony Hillerman, they went to school here, even though it was a girls' school, because they encountered such anti-Catholicism in, I don't know if it was Ashland or Kanawha, that the sisters let those two boys come to the girls' school. So, at least that's what Tony told us.
His parents are buried here in the cemetery.
Here in the cemetery.
So, as well as one other student's mother.
Yes, there was another very, very famous student here his poor body is still being argued over. and that is the great athlete Jim Thorpe. It's associated with his
His mother is buried down
So the monks not only built the complex here, but they established schools for Native American children largely and other settlers up in the Northeast in Grey Horse and Pawhuska, and a very successful school in Anadarko, St. Patrick Indian Mission that was remained open until I think the early 70s, thereabouts, early 60s, early 70s, I think. And then another bit of our history, 3 schools for black children in the 1870s. One at Lehigh, one just south of here, and one at Langston. These were the children of freed slaves. So the monks, the stories are that our predecessors were always very open to all populations, to what Pope Francis would call the marginalized, people on the margins. And we have been told that, for example, at Anadarko at St. Patrick's, the really distinguishing characteristic of the children who got to go there, again, the Indian agents picked out which schools the children went to. The other schools, their native customs and languages were physically beaten out of them. At St. Patrick's, it's different. The sisters there and the monks not only allowed the children to speak their language and to maintain their heritage, but actually encouraged it. And this is one of those stories, if it's not true, it should be. But this is told to us by the granddaughter who was raised by one of the Kiowa famous artists, Mope. She said her grandfather told a story that the monks and the sisters encouraged them to draw and to depict their Native American heritage. They were discovered by Jacobson and established the Jacobson Art School, and they became very famous and really started the modern Native American art movement. If what this woman is saying is true, the monks and sisters at St. Patrick and Anadarko are largely responsible for the success of the Kiowa Five and all that they led to. So I say those stories because what we've had over the last 100 years at Shawnee, really the monks who have gone before us and the lay people who have worked with us have maintained, I believe, some of that philosophy. Of one, that philosophy of hospitality and community that welcomes and respects others in their diversity to come and benefit from what we have to offer. And two, reaching people who are largely on the margins. And so, for example, now, over 50% of our students self-identify as being from a racial minority. And most of our students are from families of limited financial needs. So we really do continue this legacy and this incredible gift or financial arrangement that the Potawatomis made this summer. If you didn't see the headlines, the Citizen Potawatomi Nation on July 14th, the Feast of St. Kateri Tekakwitha, which is a miracle I ascribe to her intercession, brought us a check for $5 million for prepaid tuition and fees for scholarships over the next 5 years for members of the tribe. So I'm glad you're here to hear some of this remote history because it's still very much connected to what I hope that you all experienced and what we continue to do there at St. Gregory's as well. So to sum up that early pre-Sacred Heart history, I say the monks that nobody wanted went to a land that nobody wanted to serve a people that nobody wanted. It's a match made in heaven. And by God's grace, we continue today. Monastery and boys' school, which would have stretched, Father Adrian, see where those trees are right there? Just past this moat section. There's 3 little trees. That's probably toward the north end there, almost to where those trees are there. One long wooden structure. Then the sister's little house would have been a little bit farther down the hill. The church
would have been about right here, where those cedar trees are, facing north and south. The girls' school would have been just past where those concrete walls are. The stone building over there is the bakery that I referred to, and then the two-story log cabin. Both of those structures date back to the 1880s. So they were north of where the fire started. So the wind blew the fire away. Now, if you look closely, we're standing in the middle of what was the second monastery. On the back, you can see a concrete slab. You can see on the north where there's a concrete foundation. There's a line of stone here. And here's the front foundation here. Depending on what time of year and when the cleaning crew has last been, sometimes these foundation stones are really uncovered and you can see them very clearly. But this is the front door. You can see the foundation of a porch here. Now, one thing that's very interesting, how many of you have heard of St. Catherine Drexel? You're standing where she's been. St. Catherine Drexel visited here, and she writes in her journal about her visit to Sacred Heart and how she came into this building. And she describes it and how poor it was, and the bare boards and just benches to sit on in the little chapel that the monks had. And obviously the monks were going to be asking her for money, right? Because she paid for missions for Indian children and black children. That was her drive in her spending the wealth that she had control over. In her journal, she ends her entry about Sacred Heart by saying, "This is by far the poorest mission I have ever seen. God must love it most of all." Now, if you think about monks throughout the ages, one of the difference between monks being one of the oldest forms of consecrated life, one of the distinguishing vows that monks, and I say monks, I mean both men and women communities, we take a vow of stability. Monks don't take what you might hear poverty, chastity, obedience as the vows that religious orders take. That's not the vows that monks take. We take vows of obedience, stability, and conversion of life, which involves, celibacy and all, individual poverty and all that. But stability is very important because the monastic movement in Europe really took off. They started in Egypt and Syria in the 300s, the 200s, the 300s, the 400s. But around the time of St. Benedict, the Roman Empire and all the structure that represented for Europe, the Middle East, and Northern Africa started crumbling. That meant your forms of government, your economic systems, trade routes, communications. There was constant civil war and invading peoples. So monastic communities really began to spring up at that time, and St. Benedict lived between roughly the years 480 and 540. And he wrote the rule that we follow. But this vow of stability probably was the charism that the church and culture, Western culture, needed at that time. Because for the next 600, 700 years, monasteries with their stable committing to a particular place became centers of culture. They preserved literacy and literature. That's why the monks chose books and works of the ancient world. They built homes or monasteries that were architecturally solid and significant. They developed farming methods that improved yield on crops. For example, instead of dividing your field in half and leaving half of your land fallow one year while you farm the other and then switching them, they divided the land up into thirds. So you farmed 2/3 of your land at a time rather than just half, and did a 3-year rotation. So little things like that monks had to take care of where they lived and transform it. And of course then people began to come to the monasteries for education, for commerce, for inspiration, spiritual care, and that's how throughout Europe and in other parts of the world the monasteries became centers of culture. It's the same here. So when the monks came from France and other parts of Europe and established Sacred Heart, you think of what was happening in this part of the world. Not only were Native American peoples being uprooted from their ancestral homelands and many being made wanderers when they hadn't been wanderers, or many who were wanderers and hunter-gatherers were now being forced to stay put in a particular place and learn how to grow crops, and not only that, but learn how to get along with the 30 other Indian tribes that used to be enemies with you, and now we're supposed to get along because we're all Indians. You know, this very complex history going on right here. And then, the post-Civil War and the Reconstruction that's going on. And then, after 1889, all of a sudden, the government wanted this land for the white folks. So now you had this series of land runs, where 1889 there were like 6 or 7 land runs coming in. So all this, again, instability, economic change, communication change, not particularly completely unlike the 6th century in Italy, right? So the monks came here and established a place. And they began their schools. They began to teach agriculture. They began to work with buildings. And they began also to bring, they weren't English monks, they were French monks. They had to have nice gardens, right? Formal gardens. And so we see a little bit of evidence of that still remaining around the grounds that I'll point out to you. One of them being, look straight across from the front door of the second monastery. You see here 2 rows of stately cedar trees. Now, and at the end, there's a little arbor with a pedestal. Now, in Catholic culture, if you count all the existing cedar trees and the stumps where there used to be cedar trees, there are 14. 14, 7 on each side. In Catholic devotional practice, what might 14 represent? The Stations of the Cross. Now, I don't know that the Stations of the Cross were attached to those trees, but it's interesting to speculate. Those trees didn't drop there by accident. No. And at the end, that pedestal, if you go behind the monastery at St. Gregory's today, you'll find a tin, or it's a very poor metal, but it's a beautiful statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in our garden at the Abbey. It used to be here. So we've taken that. So here you're standing in this week of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day and commemoration. We know that one canonized saint walked right here. And between those lay people who dedicated so much for their families and those sisters, both the Mercy and the Benedictine, and the monks, surely other saints have walked here before us as well. And they've entrusted to us what they started here. So this was a place that was a stable place of culture. Now, of course, we also have a process in Benedictine life where one can transfer one's stability. It's a process, transfer of stability. So in one sense, the community transferred our stability to Shawnee in the 1920s. But St. Gregory's remains. What, in my homily this morning, I said what Benedictine Hall represents. It's an icon of something much more than just a building. We're in the monk cemetery here at Sacred Heart, and so these were some of the founders here. You'll recognize the abbots who are buried here. Their headstone is just a little bit different. So we've got Felix de Grasse, if anybody lived in de Grasse Hall. That's Felix de Grasse buried here. This is Abbot Bernard Murphy. If you look through the cafeteria, And this is a very significant headstone over here because this is the grave of Father Isidore Robeau. In many ways, Father Isidore Robeau, who lies in peace here, is the founder of the Catholic Church in what is today Oklahoma, the first prefect apostolic of Indian Territory. Now, where is Brother Dominic Lambert? So after Father Isidore's death, eventually Brother Dominic returned to France. He was at a monastery in France. Then the state suppressed the monastery again. In fact, yesterday was an anniversary of one of the suppressions of our mother house by the French government. But he died at a monastery in Belgium. Eventually, though, in recent years, his body was reinterred at our mother house at La Pierre-Cavire. So Brother Dominic Lambert is at the mother house. But this is the grave of Father Isidore Robeau. Also in the cemetery, a couple things you might point out. There's a row of headstones at the, I'll say, the head of the cemetery. And these are the graves of the French nuns. Now, some would said to me, "Oh, those poor nuns are buried in the back over there." Well, look at them. They're at the head of the cemetery, aren't they? What's interesting is, after we leave this cemetery, we'll go down to the Sisters of Mercy. The sisters here are buried by their religious tradition and community, not by male and female. So the sisters are Benedictine nuns, so they're buried with the Benedictine monks. Another plaque that I'll point out is there's a stone over there, and that's the gravestone, the grave for Father Timothy Murphy. He was the first chaplain, and this is what the monument commemorates. He was the first chaplain to die in the Great War. And what's the Great War? World War I. Now, he wasn't shot. He wasn't run over by a horse. How do you think he might have died?
Illness?
Illness, in particular in 1917, Spanish influenza. It was the world pandemic of Spanish influenza. He no doubt was ministering to people infected. As a little side note, I think the theory now is that pandemic actually started in Kansas, and it was carried by the troop ships then back to Europe, and with the weakened, the effects of war, that then the pandemic began to spread around the world and then came back to the United States. That's at least a theory that I heard, but you can believe what you want to. Before we leave the cemetery here, we go to the sisters. I invite you now to join me in a moment of silence to maybe hear the prayers of those who have gone before us and allow us to pray for them as well. It wouldn't have been quite as easy to get around. There would have been quite a bit of undergrowth allowed to grow up, and the hedges were just completely out of control, and this was all. But I don't know if it was the monastery or the parish or the museum got a grant, and there was a landscape researcher who came down to do a study to see if she could find some of the gardens that were in the oral history of some of the Indian elders that talked about these gardens. And so she came down and began to do research, and she found all sorts of things, like the rows of the cedar trees up there, or the presence of bulbs of flowers that were still surviving, spirea and bridal's wreath, and that sort of things that were obviously planted. Well, in this area here, that would have been south of the two original schools, we see quite a bit of evidence of those non-natural plantings. So the taller trees there, you see they're in rows.
Yeah.
Nature doesn't tend to plant trees in rows, and those are nut trees. Over to our left or to the west, look, there's a row of crepe myrtle and a row of bridal's wreath, and you see a last surviving boxwood hedge that's gone wild, this green evergreen here. And at the end of that row of crepe myrtle and spirea, there's another pedestal, and no doubt there was a statue there. And one of the elders, she's probably gone to her reward now, recalled a statue of Mary. Also, she recalled near a cross there was a stream and goldfish and terraced gardens. Well, the landscape archaeologist, whatever her title was, began to dig and dig and dig, and she found here, not only in the springtime you'll find bulbs growing up and blooming, but you see this depression over here. So if you were to get closer, it's begun to grow up. You know, nature, we human beings, we're so proud of what we build. We abandon a site, 10 years, 15 years, nature's taking it back. But this depression, you see it, there's a stream bed that goes back there. The depression, if you get close and look through the bushes, is square. And then if you start looking, it's not an embankment, there are terraces. And there's even steps here. So, and look at your left, there's a cross. So that elder in her child's eye was remembering seeing the cross, stream, terraced flowers, and goldfish. And so in that square at the very bottom, no doubt was probably a goldfish pond. So we'll...
Remember also that the monks ran a farm. There was nowhere you could go to Walmart to get groceries. They had to raise everything they had. And so there was a full working farm with vineyards, fruit trees, big vegetable gardens. Everything was here. So,
including the need to store the vegetables that could over the winter with root cellars.
And that could have been the depression on the far end of the monastery.
Can you imagine the first time those monks and sisters from France encountered chiggers?
And ticks for us today. Be sure you check.
Tomatoes.
It has this upper floor to it and a basement, and as you walk around the back you can see where you go down into the basement, and how that you see the chimney where the ovens were, the beautiful cut stone. This building was meant to stay. It reminds me a little bit of, for those of you, if you've ever been to Assisi, of the Porziuncola and this pink stone of Assisi. So there's the bakery, and then the two-story log cabin you see over here predates the fire of 1901 as well, and it survived. There was here roughly a granary building. And then you go into the monastery at Shani, in the front hallway you can see pictures of what's referred to as the granary chapel. So after the fire, the monks took what ornaments they had saved and converted the granary into the chapel, which you think about it, it's kind of appropriate where the bread of life comes to us. Now, if we had another hour and a half, we'd extend our hike, and we would hike down the road here and through those trees down at the very bottom, another quarter of a mile or so, and come to a lovely pond lake fed by fresh springs, and below the pond a spring house. And a structure over where St. Benedict's spring is, it still produces water today. And in the ground, the monks created a trough in the shape of a heart with a cross on it, and it collected the water. And up until even the 80s, you could harvest watercress there. Are there still some down there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that the if you like watercress salad, you could get them down there. So this is quite a monument of faith. One thing I mentioned, there's a little bit of irony. You know, it was 5 years ago yesterday that we had the big 5.6, 5.7 earthquake that caused us to have to, well, one of the towers collapsed and the others were so damaged we had to tear them down. The Abbey Shops building is still in danger of imminent collapse, and we haven't replaced yet. Well, the previous record-holding earthquake happened, I think, in 1954, and it was like a 5.4. The second monastery building that I mentioned had been built out of bricks was standing until then, up here on the hill. And that earthquake, and it was not a
Unbelievable.
solidly built building, but so damaged it that the decision at that time was made to raise or tear down that building. It's a shame we lost it, really. But I'm glad that we've preserved what we have here, and hopefully we can continue to preserve it. The Potawatomi Nation is very interested in preserving this site as very important to their heritage. The parishioners are quite proud of the site, and this really is, as Father Adrian said, the birthplace or the cradle of the church in Oklahoma. When you look at the reach of the parishes that were founded, and there's parishes that were founded that no longer exist, and not just those parishes, but then what went beyond those parishes in the mission work. So, Father Adrian, do you have any more to say about the tour of the site down here?
Did you say the wooden building is?
I don't know what it was used for originally, but it was it pre-exists the fire.
Potawatomi call it, was inside.
Oh, there's